Hey, one more thing before you go. Narcissism. See if I can get this next word right. Machiavellianism and psychopathy. Are they dangerous? Are they psychotic? Are they serial killers? Combined, can they ruin your life? Do you know someone that fits this mold? Stay tuned in this episode. We're going to discuss those possibilities and learn what a dark triad is, how to recognize one, how they've played a part in history, and they're still playing a part in our world today, including in politics. I'm your host, Michael Herst, and this is One More Thing Before You Go, the thing about dark triads, a unique kind of evil. Welcome back. My guest today is James Leo York. He's a Kentucky copywriter who focuses on screenplays that build brands. He popularized the use of evolutionary behavior in marketing and makes promotional content for the Inventors Network of Kentucky. In writing circles, he's known as Leo, but listeners of his paranormal podcast, that's where I found him, The 13th Floor, know him as James. We're going to have a conversation with both of them. I'm really excited to have James back on the show and looking forward to learning about dark triads. That's somebody that possesses three distinct but related personality traits. We're going to learn all about them. Most of you already know Leo. He was on the show in an episode 68 where we talked about the 13th Floor, his podcast that explores the bizarre, the unique, the macabre, and the paranormal. So if you want to get to know him a little bit more, you can listen to him on that episode as well as find him on the 13th Floor. Welcome to the show, Leo.
Thanks for having me again.
Look, I'm really excited to have you on here, and I'm looking forward to our conversation, actually.
Absolutely. Me too.
So, those of you that know James or Leo, whichever you know him by, we had him on the show a little while ago. You can check back on that episode number 68 where we talked about the 13th Floor. It's his podcast that explores the bizarre, the unique, the macabre, and paranormal. So if you want to get to know him a little bit more, listen to that episode as well as find him on the 13th Floor.
Absolutely. Thanks for that.
That way we can go over where you came from and where you go and all this good stuff. But I think we got a lot of more important. That's good English, isn't it? A lot of more. We got a lot more stuff that we need to talk about. So let's get to it.
Sounds good.
The first time I ever heard the term dark triad was you, actually. It's not a term that you hear around the water cooler, actually. It's kind of a unique term. From the law enforcement perspective, I've always heard of the triads, which is like a Chinese or crime gang organization, criminal syndicate, which, if they're out there listening, no offense.
Yeah, different kind of triad altogether.
Yeah, it's a unique type of evil, I think.
Agreed. It's something more people do need to know about. Knowing these traits could be the difference between a happy, peaceful life and a very chaotic and shortened one. So, yeah.
Well, it's kind of it's an interesting term. Let's talk about where it originated from, if you know, and how, what the personality traits, because I know there's three of them that kind of encompass this.
Yeah, I'm not 100% sure who originally coined the term. I would imagine it was either Jung or Freud, but it really became popularized by a series of psychological evaluations of people in death row. People noticed that there's a tendency of folks who are on death row, some of the worst offenders, to have just a synergy, a very bad synergy of three very generally associated as negative personality traits: psychopathy, Machiavellianism, and of course narcissism. And just the prevalence of those three, just in tandem, in a place like death row, where you're generally going to have a very narrow spectrum of uh, just legitimately, I don't want to stereotype everyone on death row as evil, but I think you're going to find a disproportionate amount of quote unquote evil people in that kind of area, as opposed to, say, a random cross section of the mall. So, yeah.
Well, I mean, it's interesting because the fact that you've got three of in psychology, actually, you've got three different things that kind of combine together. So, I'm familiar with other instances where you've got something like bipolar, maybe, and you've
Sure.
got schizophrenia, or you've got depression and you have anxiety. But in
Sure.
this particular case, the narcissism, the Machiavellianism, and the what's the third one?
Psychopathy.
Psychopathy. So can you help us break those down so we understand
Sure.
what each of them are?
Absolutely. And I'll even break them down from least dangerous to most dangerous. So, oddly enough, when people think of dangerous people, they tend to think of psychopaths. But actually, only a minority of psychopaths are actually truly dangerous. Generally speaking, psychopathy is the inability or a diminished ability to empathize with others, as well as often displaying what could be regarded as destructive, most often self destructive personality traits. So, somebody who goes joyriding really, really fast without any concern about possibly striking somebody or getting killed themselves, that would be deemed a psychopathic trait. Somebody having the inability to empathize with somebody, for example, somebody gets arrested for theft and they're asked, well, what would you do in this position? And their response is, well, I wasn't in this position. Their inability to look at it from the other side, those would be psychopathic traits. However, this can be actually a good thing. A disproportionate number of, for example, CEOs are psychopathic. And it actually makes sense because they're only focused on what's good for them, which is incidentally what's good for the company, which means they can make really, really, really fast, kind of considered cruel decisions like mass layoffs without blinking. So that could be a good thing. And even in my own personal view of psychopathy, again, some of them are violent, some of them are dangerous, but doctors a lot of times benefit from being psychopaths. And if you think about it, who would you rather have operating on you? Somebody who is absolutely terrified, at some level at least, that they're going to mess up and, oh man, what am I going to tell their family if I mess up? Or somebody who's just humming along, do to do. It's just another day at the office. They don't really care what happens. They're getting paid either way. They're actually going to do that operation better because they're not, their head's not out of the game. So there's an advantage in that context to being a psychopath.
Yeah, it's kind of scary in that regard, I guess,
Mm.
when you start
Yeah,
to
a
think
little
about it,
bit.
because there's people around walking around in society that are that way,
Yeah, tons
and
of them actually.
and there's probably a borderline as to, well, I mean, I'm sure that's where serial killers come from.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah,
Serial killers, generally speaking, are psychopaths. Not always. Sometimes there's just some other criteria that leads to that behavior, but more often than not, yeah. A good way of looking at it is, I've talked to you before about Kentucky. All bourbons are whiskeys, but not all whiskeys are bourbons. There's
right.
rye and there's Irish whiskey. Well, all uh, almost all serial killers are psychopaths, but most psychopaths are not serial killers. So it is scary, but they some of them do play a role in society and do function on one way or another. And sociopaths, for example, are very similar, except they tend to be even better at functioning, and they tend to have a reduced rather than an absent sense of empathy. So that's sort of a difference between the two.
Yeah, it's interesting. I met a guy yesterday that actually confessed to being a psychopath, and he started a
Oh,
podcast, and he calls him he calls himself a psychopath in the
wow.
podcast. Um,
Wow.
he realized that I won't. I'm not saying any names
Sure.
out of privacy practice, but he in my old line of work, I ran into psychopaths. In my own line of work, I ran into sociopaths. Um, the majority of time, I didn't run into something like that that was combined. You know what I mean? Or
Yeah.
even these three, the Machiavellianism, the narcissist, and the everything. I've never. Well, I can't say I've never. I believe that when I look back on it, after talking to you and then doing research for this episode, that I think I've had contact with individuals that fit that mold. You know,
Sure.
within the same thing. In fact, I think in society we've created characters that are beloved characters actually that fit that mold. When you
Absolutely. In
start
fact,
thinking
I
about
would
it.
say we've romanticized it to a dangerous point. I think that it kind of reminds me of how about 10, 20 years ago, people loved self diagnosing with Asperger's because all of a sudden there were a lot of protagonists on TV who had
Yeah.
Asperger's. Well, now all of a sudden you see a lot of psychopathic protagonists, and it's almost like it's the cool thing to be. So you have people who actively try to uh, sort of fit their own personality traits within that sphere, and it's like that's not something you should want to be. I think
No.
it's a at worst, I think it's a sad existence. As somebody who's very empathic, it's to me it'd be like being colorblind. Like
Well,
it's like
absolutely.
being emotionally colorblind. Yeah,
Well, it's like Joaquin Phoenix as the Joker, or Heath
yeah,
Ledger as the Joker. You
yeah,
know, people went, wow, I love this character, love this character, love this character. But everything that defines a triad defines both of those characters.
yeah,
You know,
absolutely,
no empathy, no compassion, no humanity.
right,
Get the job done, get the business done. This is my goal. I want to meet, and I'll do anything I can
right,
to meet that goal.
yeah.
So,
Well, if we had a society, if somebody told me, I need you to create a social system that encourages psychopathy and narcissism, I would imagine we've pretty much done it. Like with social
right,
media, especially these short form things like Instagram and TikTok and whatnot. I mean, it's just become such an incentive to have those personality traits. We've given people with those personality traits every advantage to succeed in modernity, and there is something terrifying about it because it does mean that right now psychopaths comprise somewhere between 5 and 10% of the population. In a
well,
couple of generations, it's probably going to double like every generation just because there's such an incentive, an economic incentive now to have those traits.
well, I think in society is well. It comes to one of my questions I was going to ask you.
Yeah.
Do you think that a dark triad is genetic, or do you think it's made? You know,
I think
are you,
it's I think it's a combination. And actually, just a little backstory on narcissism. Narcissism is the view that you are sort of the most important thing. It comes from actually Greek myth. There was a Greek mythological character named Narcissus, and he fell in love with his own reflection, and he attempted to kiss it multiple times. It was a reflection in a pool of water, and he drowned. And that's where the term narcissist comes from. It was probably Freud because he loved Greek mythology. But a narcissist thinks that they're the most important thing in the world. And unlike a psychopath, I think there are psychopaths who do good in the world. I think there are psychopaths who you could argue are good. They actually are good. They just can't empathize. I don't think I've ever met or heard of, I don't even know if it's possible for a narcissist to be a good person because they only care about themselves. It's not a question of a lack of empathy. That's common, but it's that they literally cannot imagine thinking of anything but them. Most of the time, they can't even imagine a world in which they're dead. For example, they just imagine it's the antithesis of one more thing before you go. They
right?
can't imagine a world existing without them. It's like
Yeah,
the sun would burn out when they did.
you know, you can look back even. Well, I'll go back to the entertainment aspect of it. I think because ironically enough, when I did my research for this, I found that the majority of psychologists were also attributing like important historical figures, as well as present day figures and characters that all kind of fall into the mold of the Dark Triad. You know, you like
Absolutely.
King Henry the Second, King Henry the Eighth. You know, these individuals. It's all about me, all about me, all about me, and I'll
Right.
do whatever I need to get about me, and
Yeah.
what is for me. Same thing with well, not necessarily the me part of it, but they referred to the Dark Knight, Batman, and they referred to James Bond even. because James Bond is
Interesting.
no compassion, no
It's
empathy.
true.
Get my job done. This is my goal. My goal is to be the best agent that I can be, and this is how I'm going to do it. I don't care who I step on, who I kill, this kind of a thing. And that Ian Fleming created the character, but he created it out of the loss of his wife, when James Bond lost his wife. And that created the environment to build on the Dark Triad side of it, where he's got no compassion, no empathy, and he's a narcissist where I'm Bond, James Bond.
Right.
You know what I mean?
No, that's interesting. I never thought of James Bond as being like that, but he totally is. Yeah.
But then they also refer to individual, and this is not a political statement. This is just fact, and you can look it up yourself. Not you, and I'm not saying you, but anybody out there can look it up for themselves. In today's society, they believe that even the political figures like Donald Trump is like a dark triad, because he's not compassionate. He doesn't have humanity. He doesn't have empathy. All he cares about is me, 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 me. Look at me, look at me, look at me. And it's documented all the way back to his dad trying to impress his father, and his mother telling him, you can do no wrong, kind of a situation. So I think that you find them, or do you feel, in the research that I found, but do you feel that these type of individuals that are considered dark triad can be found more in business and in politics and in positions of power?
Yeah, without doubt. Like it's not even really debatable. They are drawn to positions of power, and politics, you can't get much more powerful than that. Politics allows people to accrue a great deal of wealth. So yeah, everything about politics is going to draw narcissists and often psychopaths. And again, to reiterate, I'd much rather have a psychopathic president, king, lord, god, emperor, whatever, than a narcissistic one, because if they're psychopathic, they can really make some cutthroat decisions that might be for the common good, and they don't agonize over those decisions. Whereas if they're a narcissist, it's those decisions are all going to ultimately go down to, how is this going to affect my reputation? And that could be substantially worse for a nation than, some cutthroat decision that's ultimately pragmatic in the long run.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think it's a situation where I think any leader needs to be a certain amount of psychopath, because you do have to make those decisions. You do have to send people to war. You have to send kids to war. And I say kids because when Vietnam came about, I had friends of mine that went to Vietnam. I had uncles and aunts that went to Vietnam. I almost went to Vietnam, and they stopped it right before I was drafted. So it's a situation that you kind of go, okay, I was still a kid,
Yeah.
So,
I look at war now, and I see these young men who are drafted, or not drafted, but in this case, who are called to serve and all that, and it astonishes me, because I think back to like how I think about 18-year-old me, and I'm like, I didn't know anything. Give me a gun and put me on a plane. Goodness.
Yep, it's kind of crazy how that works. It's you stop and think back on that, and you go, wow. But then there are some countries, in the third world countries mostly, but you get kids that are 14 years old, 13 years old. They're putting a gun in their hands.
Yeah. That's why the AK is the most popular gun the world over. A little kid can clean one, field strip it, easy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. I told somebody down here in Arizona, a little kid, a 10-year-old little girl, went to a shooting range. Unfortunately, couldn't hold on to it and killed the range officer.
Jeez Louise.
Yeah, it was kind of crazy. So this is a personal question, just because it comes from my background. I was on a domestic violence task force, and now that I look back on some of the task force, just to reiterate, the task force that we were on was a multi-agency task force, and we did the worst of the domestic violence. Not that any domestic violence is acceptable, but we actually did the worst of the domestic violence, the real hardcore cases. The guys that took like gutted cats in front of their spouse to say this was going to happen to you, and then threw it in the trash can with no empathy, no compassion, no remorse, sat down, drank their beer, turned the TV on, said, get me another beer.
Right.
Kind of a situation. I look back on that, and I think that there, a lot of domestic violence situations, you don't necessarily have to be in power or in politics or
Sure.
in a leadership role to fit this dark triad.
Absolutely. And what you're saying, it's a perfect example of how psychopathy, as scary and dangerous as it is, doesn't hold a candle to narcissism. Because, if somebody's in the dark triad, obviously they have all those traits and they're much more dangerous as a result. But I have found that domestic violence is usually a result of narcissism and not psychopathy. And it's a perfect example of that desire for control over something. Some of these people, they aren't suited to be bankers, they're not suited to be senators, so they just want to be the god of one thing, and that's usually someone smaller than, weaker than them. And if they're a man, that usually means a woman. If they're a woman, it usually means a child. And so what you end up with are these very, very mortifying instances of just the cruelest kinds of abuses that, and that's really what makes them dangerous. People think about the villains in Lifetime movies, and of course, they're analogs in real life, and they think, well, why doesn't she just leave? Why doesn't she just leave? Well, when they leave, that's actually when they're at the most danger, unfortunately, because if they leave a narcissist, that is, there's no greater sin. I mean, you have literally defied the will of a god, the only being that matters, and there's only one course of action to a narcissist that will make up for that. If they can't have you, no one can. And that's where you see these terrifying instances of homicide.
And unfortunately, that's why restraining orders in that particular instance don't work, because a restraining order is a piece of paper. Yes, there's
Exactly.
consequences, but you got to catch them.
Right.
If you don't catch them in the act, and then they get away with it,
Yeah.
and they can go back and do it again, and all it does is build upon their ego to say, "I got away with it
Absolutely.
again. I got away with
Yeah.
it again."
Well, furthermore, a restraining order is a boundary, and nothing makes narcissists angrier than a boundary. You could come up with the most. I've done this before. I've actually manipulated narcissists before by telling them, you can do this, you can do that, just don't do, and then whatever it is I actually want them to end up doing, so that they'll not be as much of a problem for whoever I'm speaking on their behalf. And guess what they will do? The one thing they're not allowed to do. That's just
Mm.
the inherent nature of a narcissist. If you give them a boundary, they must cross it.
I've dealt with a few of those individuals in my career. Yes, I have. In my personal life too, actually.
Sure.
Very interesting. So
Yeah,
I'm assuming that there can be male and female dark triads.
absolutely. There can. Now, statistically, and this is based on limited observation, and not my observation, mind you, but a number of professionals have concluded that there are far more male narcissists and psychopaths than female. And I think the reason for that is environmental. And you asked me if I thought it was genetic or environmental. I think there's a genetic component to psychopathy, but I think narcissism and psychopathy both build on environmental factors, including trauma. And we live in a world where men are supposed to compete with other men, gain prestige, gain money, and so on. So there's all these factors where if you have that personality trait, there's an immediate advantage, at least in the short term. So I think that lends itself to either more male narcissists and psychopaths, or, and this is possible, more male openly narcissists and psychopaths, and women are more inclined to be covert. And covert narcissism and psychopathy is absolutely a thing, and it does fly under the radar. Similarly to sexual abuse. Sexual abuse, if you actually look at the numbers, it's actually about equal, male and female, but you don't really hear about, like, when I mention like a sexual predator, you immediately think of a dude with a pencil mustache and Coke bottle glasses and a comb over. You're not going to think of some Marilyn Monroe looking lady, even though they're definitely out there.
Absolutely. I think you see that in some of the high profile cases where teachers in the middle school,
Absolutely.
end up getting caught and so forth. Um, I read that what psychologists are finding in society, as well as professionals in other forms, is that the dark triads are what makes them so dangerous is their malevolence.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And that goes double for narcissists, because if they are crossed, it does lead to. And that's the sad thing about the dark triad, is they all build off each other. If somebody is a narcissist, they're not necessarily dangerous, but they are probably not inherently capable of doing anything for anyone. I mean, everything is selfish inherently. Psychopaths have limited empathy, and Machiavellians are just capable and willing to manipulate others. That's all that means. Poor Machiavelli, by the way, he was not a Machiavellian. He was actually a really nice guy, and he gets that named after him because he wrote The Prince. But if you take all three of those traits and you combine them, what you end up with is someone who is utterly selfish, like a narcissist, who is not afraid to take enormous risks that could harm others, like a psychopath, and is capable of manipulating people into helping them get those goals done, like a Machiavellian. So when you compound those, you have something that's infinitely more dangerous than just one of those traits.
I think that, you look back and we're talking about history and some of the ones from the past and the politics from today, you can pretty much put most dictators within that
Oh, yeah,
realm, I think.
absolutely. Oh, 100%. You'd be scarce to find a dictator who doesn't fit that. In fact, I would argue, it's I can't remember who said power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. One, corrupt people just gravitate towards those positions anyway, and this goes hand in hand with that environmental component. I think just being given that kind of power is going to innately cause a person to become inherently more narcissistic and psychopathic. Period. Machiavellianism, I think that's more of an innate trait, and it's the least problematic of all three until it gets compounded.
Right.
If somebody's just Machiavellian, it's like, wow, you talk your way out of parking tickets, and you're really good at selling insurance. But then when you add psychopathy and narcissism to it, then you got a serial killer.
So can we put car salesman in that?
Yeah, absolutely. Speaking of which, perfect example of Machiavellianism and the danger of it. Shoot, who was that serial killer in Wisconsin who would hate people?
Oh, yeah, I know you're
Yeah.
talking about. He,
Oh my
Dahmer,
goodness.
Dahmer.
Dahmer. Yeah, Jeffrey Dahmer. Perfect example of Machiavellianism. He abducted a 14-year-old boy, took him to his house, drugged him, was going to murder and eat him. This boy gets loose and runs to the police, and they recognized him as part of the gay community, this boy, and they sort of turned a blind eye to a lot of the creepy, more underage stuff in those communities, at least during this period of time. I'm not sure about now. But he was drugged, and so he was slurring and he's begging them to take them away because he's telling them this man's going to kill him. And Jeffrey Dahmer shows up, explains to the police, "Oh my God, no, he's my lover, and he just had a little one too many. That's why he's slurring. Anyway, I'm going to get him home. I'm going to get
Whoa.
him sobered up. Take care." They of course believed him. He takes him home, eats him, rapes the body, the whole nine yards. He does atrocious things, and he got caught. Is the thing, but perfect example. Here's somebody who is probably not narcissistic in this instance. I'm not sure, but definitely a psychopath, and
Whoa.
definitely the fact that he was Machiavellian is what allowed him to get away with it because he
Talk
was
away.
able to
Yeah, I didn't know
persuade
that.
people.
I didn't know that part of that story. Wow,
Mhm.
that was kind of crazy. I wonder what those cops were thinking after that.
Yeah, right. Oof.
It's like, yeah, who won that pool? Like, I knew something was wrong. You didn't.
Right.
That's crazy, crazy. Um, do you think there's such a thing as a white triad?
Ooh. Oh, what a fun concept. I've never heard of one, but I would imagine that people who are empathic would be on with an empath. I would argue is the opposite of a psychopath. I would argue that an altruist is the opposite of a narcissist, and that only leaves Machiavellianism. What would you call that? I suppose genuine leadership, like where you're not manipulating people; they're actually following you because you're looking out for them. Everybody knows somebody like that who, it's the top brass sergeant who is in the trenches with the basic infantry, that kind of person. And it's funny. We even see good leaders like that. We've had leaders who I would argue you could say are white triad folks. They are empathic and they are altruistic, and they're not beneath being with the lowest ranked folks. I don't know who would fit all of those, but it's kind of funny. I can think of a historical narcissist who was also very altruistic and relatable, and that would be Alexander the Great. He was
Yeah,
somebody who was simultaneously thought he was destined to rule the world,
yeah,
but was also just the kind of guy that his soldiers absolutely adored. So I don't know.
yeah. I think he took all of his gold and paved the road to his funeral and
Ah,
his burial with the gold, and then made sure that his hands were dropped down below the bed that they had him on while they carried him up there, so that his hands run along the gold road all the way up to
huh.
where he was buried.
That's interesting. I didn't know that. Huh.
Interesting thing I just learned. Well, I didn't just learn it. We learned it a little while ago. History Channel. Love the History Channel.
Me too.
It was
Yeah.
pretty
Fun
cool.
fact about Alexander. This, I think, is a great example of why you should not be a narcissist. It's very humbling to consider. He fought so many men, and no part of his body wasn't scarred. He survived so many battles, but he died young because he was bit by the umble mosquito. He got malaria, and that's what did him in. So even an emperor can get laid out by a mosquito.
Yeah, well, ironically enough, I think we talked about this in the last episode or prior to it. When I got my rheumatoid arthritis, severe rheumatoid arthritis, my doctor, who is now written up in several journals with his research, attributed my rheumatoid, because it's not genetic in me. He did a DNA test and did not find it anywhere in my DNA. That I had taken a trip to Mexico, my wife and I did. We were in Tulum and Chichen Itza, and he had a study group where 17 other people were in the same area of Mexico, all came back with the same type of rheumatoid arthritis I have.
Whoa, trippy.
He attributed it to, and he continued that research. And in fact, he's written up in several medical journals now with his study, including I'm in there, I'm within that, in regard to how I obtained or how I got rheumatoid arthritis.
Wow.
It's pretty crazy.
So I mean, he thinks it was a mosquito bite specifically.
Yep, he thinks a mosquito
Wow,
bite that was bitten down in either Tulum or Chichen Itza, Mexico.
trippy. Huh. Well,
And
I'll be. That is bizarre.
pretty crazy. Yeah, and I can believe it. I mean, I look back
Sure.
in my history, both sides of my family, all the way back to, well, upon my grandmother or from my mother's side of the family, we're back to like the 14th century. There's no mention of any time of rheumatism or rheumatoid or anything else. My mother had 7 other brothers and sisters, no rheumatoid
Yeah. So
arthritis.
interesting.
And their kids, no rheumatoid arthritis. I'm the only one from that side. On my father's side, same thing. I went back. I couldn't go back as far as the 14th century, but as far back as I could go, which was about the 1820 area.
That's pretty far back.
No mention of it. In fact, we had a doctor in the family in the 1800s, 1900s, and nothing about rheumatoid arthritis.
Wow.
It was
Yeah, that's
crazy.
neat that you guys had doctors. My family, up until 2 generations ago, it was just witchcraft. So,
Well, kind of, you can almost put them together, almost.
yeah,
They both perform a little bit of unique magic.
yeah, very true.
My surgeons did a little magic and got me out of a wheelchair. See, so
Absolutely.
it kind of works. Um, yeah, it's from that perspective, it's kind of an interesting thought. You go back on history, especially with Alexander the Great, and that was one of the other ones I was going to ask you about actually down the road here, in regard to whether or not you felt that he might be something like a dark triad, or because of what he wanted to accomplish. I mean, theoretically, if you look back at most people who tried to conquer 90% of the world, had to have some form of that one way or the other, because of what they did and how they did it.
I imagine so. Yeah, it would be difficult. I think. I mean, just think about the role of a dictator or a politician, even in a republic. The idea that you should control people, the idea that you should be in charge. It's an odd thing. It's an odd view to have, to look at a number of individuals who can make their own decisions and say, no, I need to micromanage that. I need to make decisions for these folks. I think just inherently there's going to be a narcissistic streak in people who are drawn to politics. And that doesn't mean everyone, but I certainly think it's disproportionate. I think if I think if you were to round up 100 politicians and 100, I don't know, let's think of just some random realtors, 100 realtors, I think you would find that, maybe 5, 10% of those realtors have psychopathic or narcissistic traits. They probably all have Machiavellian traits because you got to be good at selling. But then if you were to look at those politicians, I'd say it would be at least half of them. And that's me being generous. It's probably higher.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I think at one time or another we've all run into a dark triad in one way or another, not realizing who were going into. And some people, if you look back on who they called evil, as I said earlier, it's a unique type of evil. I think in that unique type of evil is because they have those traits that combine, and those traits that combine make them a person that really doesn't care one way or the other, can't empathize with you, has no compassion for you, and wants what they're going to want. And if you're standing in their way, too bad.
Yeah.
Kind of thing. And then wants everybody to thank them for it, so to speak.
Yeah.
You should be grateful that I stepped on you and climbed the ladder, so to speak.
That's how they look at it. Yeah, because nobody else matters. Nobody matters but them. Yeah, I mean, if you were to rank them, I would say if you meet someone who's Machiavellian, don't even worry about it. If you meet somebody who's psychopathic, evaluate their other aspects of their personality, whether this is good or bad. If they're a narcissist, walk away. Just walk away now. Do not interact further with that person as much as you have to. And if they have all those traits, run. Get out of there. get as far away as possible.
Yeah, that's push them out of the way.
Yeah.
Well, that answers how do you steer clear of one.
Yeah.
You push them away while you're running away. Thank you.
Yeah, there you
go. Do you think that if you have a friend or you have somebody that you are within your circle, let's say, that you feel follows this suit, can they be changed, do you think?
Change, not so much. What you really need to look at is which traits they have. If they were if they were psychopathic, then you should evaluate other aspects of their personality. But if they're a narcissist, I would slowly remove ties through a process called gray rocking. And what gray rocking is when you talk to somebody who's a narcissist, they inherently want excitement out of you. They want drama. They want to know the dirt on somebody. They want to know something that's going on. And above all else, they want it to tie into praising them in some way. And so by gray rocking, by being an incredibly lackluster, boring individual who has no drama going on at all, they're going to lose interest in you. And that's the best and safest way to deal with a narcissist because they don't handle rejection well. So put yourself in a scenario where you're just not fun to be around anymore so that they will reject you. And if you're in a romantic relationship, this goes double if you're a woman, maybe even triple if you're a woman. Do this gray rocking, make yourself not fun to be around, and then brace because they will tell stories to everyone about you afterwards. Narcissists don't like having exes, and so they have to come up with reasons for why. So if you're in a relationship with a narcissist and you're a woman, get ready because once it does end, they're going to tell everybody and their grandma, oh, I just couldn't be with her anymore. She was too freaky. Oh, you wouldn't believe the stuff she got up to. Oh, it was messed up. I had to call the fire marshal on one occasion. She's just a nut. That's how they generally pave over pre-existing relationships.
Well, that's too bad, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Do you think society, and again, obviously this is all subjective and it's opinion,
Sure.
our opinions, but I believe, and do you think that society has kind of opened the door to allow more of that type of behavior to come out?
Oh, without question. I mean, we've created a perfect storm where having those traits has become an asset rather than a liability. If you look at like literally human history up until the Industrial Revolution, up until that point, if you had those kind of traits, you were either going to be a really charismatic lord or chieftain, or more likely, you were eventually going to be ostracized as the weirdo who doesn't care about the tribe, about the group. Altruism was a huge part of human civilization up until very recently. And with the Industrial Revolution, and doubly so with the advent of famous people, I should use air quotes, celebrities that all got started with opera in the industrial era. Now all of a sudden you have an instance where having those traits means that you'll be successful. Not necessarily, but it can absolutely springboard you to success having those traits. You could be a politician, you could be a CEO, you could have, five ex-wives and 20 kids because you used to be a rock star. You can have those traits. And now we're seeing it far worse on social media. I mean, now we're seeing people who, they'll get millions of subscribers because, hey guys, I found this cat. It was drowning and I rescued it. And everybody thinks they're a saint. And now they've got women throwing themselves at them. And, turns out they were drowning the cat. And then they turned the camera on when they were pulling it out of the bucket. That's, it's very disturbing. I do think that it's going to be on the rise in the coming decades. And it's not going to bode well.
Yeah, I agree with you in that regard. I think the society has kind of turned a corner in regard to that, and I think that this is just again from a personal perspective. This is my opinion, and this comes from I grew up in the '60s and the '70s. I grew up in the racial tension. I grew up in the hippie world. I went through all that. I've watched it change, and I've watched it change to one way, and now unfortunately I'm watching a lot of traits come back, and society has started. I won't say turning evil, but they've really lost what society is meant to be.
Yeah.
And
And this is my radical take on it. This is me going really wild with it, but I think that as we create a more globalized and technology driven world, that's going to be on the rise, and the solution is actually to just be more tribal. We have to go back.
well, and I hate to say this when I say this, reality is that society created a normal that was prior to 2020. COVID it was a double-edged sword. Of course, it was the devastating aspect of over 600,000 people died from it, and there's more people dying from it. And I mean, here in the United States, obviously worldwide, it's like over 4 million. They closed down economies, they closed down countries. So from that perspective, it was a double-edged sword. But from a humanity or compassion perspective, from that perspective, you found more community. Like in Italy, they were showing people in the neighborhoods leaning out the windows and singing and serenading people and pulling the whole neighborhood together to stick together through this, even though they were all stuck in their apartments. In France, they did the same thing. And in America here, we saw people leaning out and clapping and cheering the nurses and the doctors that were going in. It created an environment for people to, like my wife and I have been together for 32 years. It's a long time. We've been through a hell of a lot, especially with me getting injured, my disease, my wheelchair, my surgeries, everything we've been through, like my whole family.
Absolutely.
You get in that grind every day. She drives an hour and 20 minutes to work, fighting traffic here in Phoenix. She drives an hour or more, hour and 20 minutes or more, coming home in the same nasty traffic. We took a pause last year. She got to work from home for an hour and a half. Her commute was 30 seconds. We had lunch every day. We had breakfast every day. We went on the back patio, and instead of her drive to work, we sat on the back patio watching the birds and the hummingbirds and looked at the bunnies in the backyard. And in Colorado, we had elk. Here we have bunnies. And having a cup of tea. She had a 30-second commute. It was great.
Yeah.
And it allowed us to take the time to meditate and take the time with each other to go, hey, we forgot what it's like to have breakfast or lunch together. We forgot what it's like to have dinner at a decent time instead of 8 o'clock at night because, by the time you get home, it's a situation. So how do we know that's not the normal? How do we know
that was the norm?
Exactly.
I mean, unironically, 100,000 years ago, this is what people did. They woke up really, really early. The women would pick food. Sometimes the men would too. The men would go on, 5 human being hunting parties with a couple of dogs. And the rest of their time, almost all of their time, was just spent socializing and relaxing. It was an easier life, oddly enough.
Absolutely.
And you absolutely had to rely on each other. The tribal existence that we evolved for is the natural state of being, and the closer we can get to that, and the way people can do that is creating tight knit close communities. That's really the best and healthiest way for people to live, not just in terms of avoiding the dark triad personality traits, but just being fulfilled and happy in general.
I agree with that 100%. I agree with that. And I think, unfortunately, you said something earlier about social media. Social media is creating those environments for that because it's how many listeners can I get, or they get mad because they haven't reached a certain number of listeners or a certain number of subscribers or a certain number of follows. And that, look at me, what can I do to get to that million? I mean, obviously I'm on social media for my podcast.
Me too.
I'm on social media. It's a requirement. I have to be there.
Sure.
But my goal is to get more listeners, which kind of falls into the same thing in a sense, because in reality, I'm trying to provide something for people that allows them to be motivated, inspired, to be educated.
Yeah. And you hit the nail on the head. You're trying to create something with value, whereas these narcissistic types, they are the thing of value, and the listeners are a measurement of their value rather than what they make being a commodity to improve other people's lives.
100%. Speaking of commodities, let's talk about the 13th floor. So tell me a little bit about the 13th floor and what's coming up next.
Sure. Yeah. 13th floor is myself, Alex, and Cece. And we talk about conspiracy theories, paranormal things, cryptids, just all things strange. That's our tagline, keep it strange. And today, oddly enough, at the time of this recording, which might be in the future, we just came out with modern vampires. And next week, we are coming out with ghost ships. So those are two very fun episodes that were very fun to record.
Outstanding. And where can they find you?
We're on all major platforms, Spotify, Apple. We're everywhere. Just look for 13th Floor Podcast and look for the little red stairs and black and white stripes and give us a listen.
And you got it. You can take a screenshot of this on YouTube, or I'll have all that stuff in the show notes as well, so that you had easy access to find the 13th Floor. It's a great podcast. You really need to listen to it. It's got some very interesting stories. It'll educate you. It will motivate you. It might scare you a little bit, but you need to be there.
Awesome. Thanks much.
So this is one more thing before you go. And as you know from the last time, I always ask before we leave, and in this episode, do you have any words of wisdom?
If somebody does not behave in accordance to the boundaries that you've set, you're better off looking for better friends, better relationships, even better family. And that absolutely counts. If a family member, as close as you are to them, exhibits these traits to the point that it's toxic, at that point, you're better off without them. So walk away.
Great words of wisdom. I really appreciate that.
Thank you.
James Leo York, thank you very much for joining me on this program. I know you as Leo. Your fans know you as James. So I know both of you.
Thanks for having me. It was
I
very
appreciate
fun.
this conversation. Stand by 1 second, if you will, please.
Thanks for listening to this episode of One More Thing Before You Go, a unique conversation about life. If you like our show and want to know more, check out our website at beforeyougopodcast.com. That's beforeyougopodcast.com. Tell your story, share your expertise, contribute to the blog, and subscribe to the newsletter. You can find us as well as subscribe to the program and rate us on your favorite podcast listening platform.
And one more thing before you go. Have a nice day, have a nice week, and thanks for listening.
One More Thing Before You Go, a unique conversation about life podcast, is a creation of One More Thing Productions, established 2010, all rights reserved.